My name is Gareth Kidd. I'm the training consultant here at Isentia 2 Social, which means I get the fun job of presenting these webinars with and without audio. It depends on how you like it, of course, as well as doing all the workshops and in-house training sessions, etc. And so I saw a couple of names that were quite familiar on the list. So if you haven't been to one of our courses, welcome to our webinars as well. And also for those who have been on our webinars before, welcome back. And if it's the first time, I hope that now with hearing my dulcet tones, you're going to take a little bit more out of it than just the slides. What fun would a training session be without some technical difficulties, guys? So, as mentioned, we're going to be going through digital content's impact on the news. And effectively what I want to take you guys through today is the where, the what, and the how. And that's going to be the where are we? Where are we at the moment? The what. So what are some of the changes that we're seeing in the space, on the platform? And then move into the how. How can we then maximize our effect on the news? How can we maximize our audience seeing our content by taking advantage of these aspects? Just a little bit of housekeeping, guys. Feel free to throw some questions through to us using the chat panel or by using the hashtag Isentia courses if you're going to be a bit of a Twitter fiend. We will get to those questions at the end. We are actually recording the audio and visual for this webinar, so we'll be able to cut that up for you guys, send it out. So if you do have to leave us, given the fact we're running a bit over time, you guys will receive this recording emailed to you after the fact. We'd love you to stay to the end and throw us a couple of questions. So the first slide I want to talk to you about is where do people get their news? This is where people get their information and news from when it comes to the web and digital. As you can see, it's quite dramatic when you think about the growth of news finding and news aggregation on social, but it really is a changing way that we actually find our information and news. I sit on Twitter for the latest and breaking news. I jump to Facebook to see what my friends are sharing and information, etc. LinkedIn for a whole lot of business news and thought leadership. So people are sitting on these platforms to actually find out what's going on in and around brands as well as just the wider world itself. We have a stat that we talk about at Isentia 2 Social, and it's that 47% of all online time is spent on social media, and that's not just because they're sharing cat videos and that they're wanting to tell their friends about what they just ate for dinner. It's because they can use it to aggregate their news like what they're saying here. Now, Twitter hasn't grown as much as Facebook has, as you can see there, by way of people going to the platform specifically for news. And obviously one of the reasons for that is Facebook's got 1 billion daily active users, and there's a lot more content floating around there. Now, if you want to see any sort of proof as to how impactful and how people get their news on social, you don't have to go past, unfortunately, the macabre example of the Paris attacks. For a lot of us here in Australia and New Zealand, given the time zone, we found out about this on a Saturday night, and it's a really poignant example about how we found out about the information, that we weren't finding out about it through our traditional sources of print and TV. We found out about it through social. The other example being, if anyone follows the presidential election campaign over in the US, there's so much more information, so much more news being put out about that campaign, whether depending on your political inclination, floating around on social than there is offline. So this is where people are looking to find the latest information. Now, I know some of us might scoff at the thought that I refer to BuzzFeed as news, given the fact they quite often put up your listicles, your list articles. For instance, if anyone wants to read it, there's a great piece called The 47 Facts of Why Social Media Trainers Are the Best and Most Awesome People in the World. Granted, they haven't published my article yet, but they will. Don't worry. Give it a little bit of time. But in 2013, BuzzFeed had what was quite a dramatic year when it comes to their traffic. So if you look, there's a significant shift in referrals. So the blue line there, which is on the downward trend, that's people coming in through the homepage. So that's people going to buzzfeed.com.au and then filtering through the different articles, reading along, etc. The purple line down the bottom, which is on the uptrend, is the social referrals. That's people coming in through social channels. As you can see, in 2013, they saw the biggest shift of these lines converging, and now it is much, much more weighted towards social referrals. So why is this? Well, effectively, it's because of the social sharing. It's because that whilst we may put this content up on the channels, it also means that shareable information, so content that's actually relevant to our audience, gets pushed out through their channels as well, which dramatically increases the people who click through to our page. So whilst a lot of us think about our homepage first and the journey for our audience from there, we really need to think about where our audience is getting their news. And obviously digital content being put on social is a big driver of that. For those of you who want a little bit more of a journalistic authority to illustrate this fact, the New York Times, on the left here, you can see that the top graph, similar situation, homepage visitors on a downward trend. So over the space of 2 years, they saw 100 million less people coming through the homepage. In the bottom graph, though, you can see that the page views, so the amount of pages within their website that have been viewed, is pretty static. It's going along at around the sort of 6 to 7 million. So what this means is people are finding other ways to source their news. They're not going to the publication page. They're not going to newyorktimes.com to find out the latest news. They're finding it elsewhere. Now, obviously, this is not just social here in this graph. This would also be the likes of Google and dark referrals, so email and messenger apps, etc. But people aren't coming through the traditional front door. And for a closer to home example, the Australian, only 40% of desktop users visit the homepage. So only 40% of people are going to theaustralian.com.au and then reading the news. And that drops even less to mobile. And that's not surprising at all, considering mobile usage of devices. People tend to use their mobiles a lot more for social media. So when it comes to people aggregating and finding out their information, social channels really are the way that people tend to be coming in through the door. And so this site really sort of sums up what we're saying there. You know, that Facebook is the leading source of referral traffic to news websites, and that was from our last year's stats. So Google sites, you know, they've been trumped, which is a really big surprise when you think about, you know, the power of Google search engines and where people traditionally would find out information. But now it's being served to them in their news feeds, in the likes of Facebook, the likes of Twitter, and LinkedIn. So a nice little quote, love quotes. When we're no longer able to change the situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. And I know that's a pretty quote, and it would be wonderful with a background of a nice lake that we could post up on LinkedIn. But what does this mean to us? Well, we can't change the situation, the fact that people are finding their information on social, on Facebook, on Twitter. In print, we used to be able to organize the content. You know, we used to be able to put our front page, full page spreads. We used to be able to think very thoughtfully about the messages and the news that our audience read specifically, but we can't do that if they're coming through to us from Facebook. Our audience is on social, so that means that the platform and the challenges there are important, but also how people absorb the news, how people are more likely to read our news is just as imperative. So let's keep that in mind as we kick on through. So let's talk about the what. You know, the what is changing. You know, what is we need to take into account. One of the big aspects has been all the rage in the news this year is the algorithmic timelines. So for those of us who are familiar with social, we probably would have heard about the Facebook algorithm, which is effectively how we see content delivered to us in our newsfeed. And that works on a bunch of different factors in the background. It works on how old the post is, how close we are to the people who posted it, and as well as how likely we are to engage with it. So that's been around for quite some period of time. So the likelihood of us being served news and content that's relevant to us is quite high on Facebook. But those who have been following social media news in 2016 would have heard that Twitter and Instagram have both announced that they are moving towards the same idea. Now this is a little bit different because previously both those platforms were what we call reverse chronological. So when you log in, you would see the most recent tweet of those that you're following, or the most recent post on Instagram, the most recent image. So for those of us who are serving our news on these channels, it does mean that we need to think about engagement factors. We need to think about putting out content that our audience are likely to share, are likely to comment on, etc. Gone are the days where we could just use Twitter as a broadcast. We could slap up, not that we'd ever want to, but you know, a lot of organizations will look at that. We can pop up our tweets there. People will see it because people are going to jump on the channel later. Increasingly, we need to take into account the likelihood of people to consume our content. So we need to think about, you know, where we're distributing our news, what platforms we're putting on, but also, incredibly importantly, is what sort of medium we're using, what sort of variety we're putting the content out on. Now, as you can probably tell, I'm a bit of a fan of quotes. Unfortunately, I don't know the source. This was actually mentioned in one of the training courses that we ran. And an ex-journo said that there's a difference between a story of public interest and a story the public is interested in. And this is something we talk about a lot in social. We use a little bit of a different context, but that's such an important thing to think about when you're discussing the news, when you're looking at putting the news out. There's a big difference between what we think is newsworthy and what our audience actually cares about. And we need to find the sweet spot between the two. Otherwise, once again, we're broadcasting. And that means that the more that we put out information we think is newsworthy and our audience doesn't care about, the less people are going to see our news, the less people are going to get involved with it, because more and more these channels will begin to drown us out. They'll stop serving our content, our news out, because it isn't newsworthy to our audience. That's very much replicated in a little bit of a poll, okay? And so that was all about, whether or not you disagree or agree with the following statement, that brands on social media are self-indulgent. So what does that mean? So that means that people who are posting out, or organizations that are posting out, are putting out content that's all about them. 72% of people agreed with that. 72% of people said, yes, brands on social, way too self-indulgent. The content they're putting out, the news they're putting out is all about themselves. And not stuff that I'm interested in, not stuff that us as an audience are interested in. Obviously, you can see there that it varies depending on the age bracket, with 60 plus very much saying that. Very, very cynical audience there. But it's important to take note of this, that people on social are thinking that brands and organizations are self-indulgent in the messages and the news that they put out. So how can we turn that around? How can we look to change that up and really make sure that the content we're putting out there isn't just broadcast, that our audience cares about it? And so the way we do that here at Isentia Social is thinking about the content creation we put out on social, whether it's news, whether it's otherwise. Now, there's what you want to say, and what you might want to say is how great your latest product is. It might be how great your policy is. It might be how amazing the people in your organization are. And unfortunately, there's no one sitting behind their PC in front of their mobile device ready and waiting for us to send those messages out, regardless of whether we think it's a public interest piece or not. There's what they're interested in. And we need to find that overlap. Even if it is a general news piece, we need to find out what they are actually interested and care about. So to really illustrate this, I want to give you guys a couple of examples we use. These are just tweets as well, but they're really pointed examples about how to really hit the nail on the head when it comes to not being a broadcaster on social, or when it comes to the news. So the census, so obviously the ABS, they love talking about stats. Stats are great. They love talking about the fact that 2.4 million Aussies own their own home outright. But if they throw out a tweet, if they throw out a piece of content on that, well, there'd be the giant noise of no one really caring. So what they've done and gone is they've thought about their audience and what their audience wants to talk about, and they've matched that up. They've married it up by throwing out, congratulations, Carleen Leighton, on winning #House Rules. Census data reveals they joined 2.4 million Aussies who own their own home outright. So to think about their audience, what does their audience care about? Well, at this stage, back in 2011, it was House Rules. It was a bit of reality TV. They've married that up with their news being the fact and information they want to talk about, that Australians, 2.4 million Aussies own their own home outright. As I mentioned, if they threw that up just as a plain old tweet, there wouldn't be too many people who really cared about that. But they've married up what their audience cares about and what they want to talk about. To those of you who are listening in New Zealand, I hope you're not part of this 1800, but the ACC over there threw out a wonderful tweet, a really tongue-in-cheek and quite amusing tweet that said, didn't get a rose. We covered 1,800 rose-related injuries last year, so perhaps that's a good thing. Be wary. Hopefully no one on this call has actually injured themselves on a rose, because that sounds quite embarrassing. But once again, they thought about what their audience wants to talk about, which was, at that stage, the Bachelor NZ, and they thought about the news that they want to project out, and they found a way to make sure that that overlapped. So whether we're thinking about our news creation or content creation, we need to think about our audience first. Now, I also mentioned that we need to think about our platform, and for those of you who were on our last webinar last month, where we talked about blogging, you'd be familiar with this concept. So Facebook's trying to get rid of what they call clickbait, which is articles or news information that is just, it's not that interesting. It's just to get people to click through to the page, and that's not valuable to the Facebook audience. So whilst we want to make our news attractive, we can't make it misleading. We still need to make sure that the content we put out there is genuinely interesting, and that the way that we present it to our audience is actually homogeneous. They're actually going to click on that and get the same feel and understanding of what we promised them on channel. Otherwise, what happens, people click through to it on Facebook and they go, well, you know what, this article has got nothing to do with what they said it was on Facebook. They jump out of it, and those pages that are putting out that content are beginning to get penalized by that wonderful newsfeed algorithm that we already touched on. So yes, we need to make sure that we're putting out content and news that our audience goes, hey, that's interesting, I want to find out more about that. But we can't mislead them. We can't say the 5 things that you're going to find out about social media in today's news. And then when they click through, there's maybe 2 really cool important pieces, and then the 3 are things from last year that no one cares about anymore, or I've just really dragged it out. And the 5th one is that social media trainers are the sort of people you want to hang out with on the weekend. You need to make sure that it really does stick with what you put out on Facebook. And so now let's talk about the content. We talked about the platform. So what's changed by way of content? Well, you know, do you remember that We Are Challenged slide? You know, that when we think about the fact that, you know, when we can't change things, we're challenged to change ourselves. Hopefully it's resonated with you, because news has generally been, you know, written. You know, it's always been, like, we look at the amount of newspapers compared to the amount of TV stations and radio, etc. And so we think about news being vastly in the written form. But we need to change our perceptions here, because we've got to think about how our audience wants to take in the news, how our audience wants to take in the messages from us. And they're a lot more varied. But anyone who's been in social for a little while, or thinks about, you know, how news now proliferates, imagery is so important. We need to remain visual, regardless of whether we're just putting out a press release or whether we're putting out a news article, whatever it is, it needs to remain visual. So taking into account other aspects, imagery, video, infographics, audio, making sure we've got that audio-visual mix. Now, a study that was done last year said that our attention spans have dropped to 8 seconds. So congratulations, everyone. We're now goldfish. And that was down from 12 seconds. So listen, I can't say that I'm too dissimilar from that, especially considering I know how frivolous my Facebook usage can be. But that same study also said that we are absorbing content and we're absorbing information a lot faster. So our ability to stay engrossed in content or the news is diminishing, but our ability to pick it up and absorb it is a lot quicker. So the reason for that is because there's a lot more multimedia aspects to it. So when we're looking at the change of news from print versus online, you know, we're really looking at going towards that video aspect. For those of you who are familiar with live streaming, it really is one of the big impacts on with digital content's impact on the news, because it's changed the way that we deliver a lot of our traditional news. We're seeing a lot of organisations and press organisations utilising these different carriers to really push out their message in a much more absorbing way. I will say, probably forget about Meerkat in the middle there. They've recently announced the fact that they'll no longer be doing live streaming. But we've got Periscope and Facebook Live, which are Twitter and Facebook's respective live streaming apps. So video doesn't have to be a laborious aspect. You know, we just have to look at the new tools that we can utilize to get that video content across, to get that news out to a wider audience in a much more palatable way. Now, we've seen some interesting organizations use it, which I'll talk about in a moment. But this has recently also been pushed out to Android users. So if there's anyone on the call that's using an Android device, it's time for you to put your hands together and applaud it now. But if you've had an iPhone, I'd hug an Android user, because you would have had this for a little while. So if we're using Facebook or Twitter to get our news across, or to even as an audience to engage with this news, it can be used in a very, very simple fashion by the same message that we put in a long-form written piece can be published in a live video piece. One example of one which I jumped on, which I thought was a very unique and probably one of the forerunners when it came to using live stream, was the Fin Times. So they use it quite regularly now, and so they will, instead of putting out, you know, your everyday articles, which they obviously still do, for some of their points they jump on a live stream. Now, what does this mean? Well, for starters, it's visual, like I mentioned. You're putting out the news is getting a lot more vibrant. They're putting a lot more information than they can in a news article. But also there's a level of engagement, and this is one of the big shifts that we've seen by way of digital content's impact on news, is that there's an engagement aspect to it. You think about when you read the paper or watched the TV before. You can't really ask questions. You read or you listen or you pay attention to the content or the news that's being pushed out to you, but these live streaming applications, these live streaming features allow you to present the news, but do it in a very engaging way because they can take feedback, they can take questions. One thing we really need to do is consider the way that we push our news out, the way that we engage with our audience, and part of that is taking advantage of new tools. I've seen sporting sites even begin to use this instead of putting out their team list for that week, chucking up a live video and getting their audience engaged in what they're talking about, as opposed to just putting out a standard piece of content. But also it comes down to where we source the news from as well, whether we are journalists, whether we're organizations that are involved in news, or whether we're just creating our own content. There was a Chelsea plane crash in Melbourne last year, and as you can see here, there's a tweet that was thrown up just by a general everyday user, and they were talking about, they threw up an image of the plane crash, and all of a sudden, that was the source of news. That was the source of news information for the different news carriers. So whether we are publications, whether we are just organizations looking at getting involved in the discussions, monitoring social is such an important part because this is where news breaks. At the end of the day, moving forward, the competition isn't just other news broadcasters, other organizations, other companies. Our competition is the audience themselves. They are breaking news, they are creating content and news themselves at a much faster rate than ever before. So what does that mean to us? What does that mean that we can harness? Well, for starters, we want to monitor those conversations. So whether we've got listening tools set up or whether we're doing an advanced search in Twitter or monitoring groups on LinkedIn, we're making sure we've got our finger on the pulse of the conversation, that when news is breaking in and around our organization, we know what's going on. Now, we can also curate it. We can also go out there and find that news and help get involved in that discussion. There was, late last year, there was the Porto's robbery, which was caught on video. So that hit the news. It was up on YouTube before it was actually broadcast out by the standard news organizations. And not too long after that, Porto got in on the joke and they were creating content in and around that because that's what their audience was talking about. And it was newsworthy, and that them as a brand got involved in that discussion with very, very quirky and unique content on social. And finally, it means that we can engage with our audience in a much better space as well. When our audience is creating this news for us, creating this content for us, we're engaging with our end users, our end readers in a much more unique and different way. So we want to make sure that where possible, we really are keeping and monitoring on those conversations and curating that content where possible. So guys, that brings us to the end of the content that we've got today. I hope so far you've really enjoyed that. We've got a couple of questions that have come through. Let me just have a look here. So the first question is, what does best practice content creation and social distribution work for in-house corporate comms team who manage their company's digital newsroom, example, G, MasterCard or ANZ Blue Notes? That is a very long question. Thank you, Adam. So when it comes to best practice, I think, like I mentioned, for starters, you want to think of very much so what your audience is interested in. I think that first and foremost, think about where your audience is. So if you're creating content, if you're creating news, who is your audience? And then basically working out which platform they're on. We tend to work backwards from distribution these days. So if our audience tends to be on Facebook, we think about creating Facebook relevant content. So video goes gangbusters on video. Video goes gangbusters on Facebook. So we want to make sure that we're thinking about creating content that will be able to reach that audience on that platform. We're thinking our audience is on Instagram. We want to make sure we've got really valuable, quirky images that will resonate with our audience. And LinkedIn, we obviously will adjust our approach there because video isn't as strong at the moment. So first and foremost, you want to think about where your audience is. But I guess that's a very broad question. I think, the distribution aspect is really the one that we really want to focus in on now because not all platforms are created equal. And if we just broadcast our message across all 3 or 4 that we're on, not only are we patronizing our audience because they're obviously, some of them will be following us on different platforms for different reasons, but we'll begin to get penalized with those algorithmic aspects that I mentioned earlier. So the more that we start just posting content that won't resonate on a certain platform, the less and less our audience will begin to see that. Alrighty, got another question that's come in, and that is, what is the future of live streaming? Well, I guess that really, I wish I had my boss's crystal ball when it comes to live streaming. But earlier this year, Mark Zuckerberg actually, when he was asked about the future of Twitter, he said they've got a lot of influencers on platform, and they've got that beautiful product they bought last year being Periscope, and so combining those two is huge. So I don't know whether or not we'll see an integration of Periscope into Twitter, but we'll definitely see those being used in more intriguing ways. Like I mentioned, we've seen some, I guess you call them challenger or very forward-thinking brands who've taken advantage of that early on. But I'd say there'd be a lot more organisations and brands taking advantage of live streaming that will only go from strength to strength. For those of you who know, when an organisation page that we like on Facebook goes live, the first time they do it, we get a notification. So even that tells us that Facebook weights that live streaming very, very highly. So yeah, there is a lot of value there for us. When do you expect to see newspapers in print fold and becoming online only? I don't know that that's going to be the case. I mean, we still know that there's around 37% of information that appears in print that doesn't appear online. So whilst I've been talking about online being in the social side of things, print isn't exactly going away anytime soon. So we still encourage monitoring both online and print, because there are still a lot of stories that break in print that don't reach to online. We have seen some organisations make it big in an online space, but I don't think anytime soon we're going to see the dissipation of that. I mean, I don't know how many people on the call, I can't exactly do a hands up, but who would prefer having a book in front of them than reading a Kindle? So I can't see newspapers completely disappearing, but we need to make sure that we're looking for news on a print as well as an online basis. I've got someone asking, can I go back to stats where people get their news? Do you have a number for the proportion of people who get their news from social media versus traditional media? Is that 64%, or is it 63% of Facebook and Twitter users who get their news? So that was those were both. So obviously a lot of people like myself, I get my news from a variety of sources. I don't have the stats in front of me of people who get it from who get their news and information from print as well. The one thing we saw, and the reason we called that out, is because that's been the upward trend that we've seen, is that more people are going to the likes of Facebook to get their news. I mean, you think about Facebook 5 or 6 years ago, and you'd only go on there to share a photo from a wedding or the meal that you ate last night, and that's why we call that out, because it's a much more intriguing upturn, the fact that people are coming to these, what we call social networking, social sharing sites, to find out the latest news and information. Alrighty, and we've got one other question. Do you see that retracting, or, well, to be honest, I think that 64% is going to increase down the line, because the more people are on site, the more news and information is being shared on that platform, the more that will increase of people wanting to find information there. But I think that from us as news creators or organisations creating content, we need to make sure that we think about what we're putting out there. So by way of talking about that Venn diagram we discussed, making sure that it's relevant to our audience, that we're thinking about what they want to discuss and not just broadcasting, because that's the challenge. If we begin to just put out our own messages and become self-indulgent, like a lot of people think brands can be on social, they will tune us out. And not only that, the pages themselves, the platforms themselves will begin to wind back our impact on the platform. So we really need to take that into account. Alrighty, guys. Well, thank you so much for your attendance. Like I mentioned, we will be shooting out a copy of this this broadcast through to you guys on email, and we will be obviously doing webinars right through every month. So keep it tuned to that. We'll shoot you out an email to welcome you to register for the next one. If you have any questions for me, by all means, feel free to hit me up on LinkedIn or on Twitter. Other than that, guys, enjoy the rest of your Thursday, and for those in New Zealand, enjoy your wine.